So this is my 5th round game from the Melbourne International Open. This round I'm playing against FIDE Master Fred Litchfield, who I have a 1-0 record against. I beat him earlier this year in the Australian Championships. In that game he went for this very dubious opening where he tried to play in a very hypermodern style and he went for this F5 break, and there was a lot of crazy stuff that happened, but eventually I end up winning. This game he decides to go for something basically the polar opposite of what he did that game. He plays a Slav defense. Can't really get more solid than this, and I do the stuff that I always do pretty much, where I play my solid line with E3, the slow Slav I like to call it, and in round 2 I actually had this exact position where I faced E6, and we had sort of a semi-Slav type position. All these moves happened, but one of the things you can make use of when, of course, your opponent plays E3 is that you're afforded the luxury of bringing your light squared bishop out, whereas say after knight C3, bishop F5, you simply can't do this because of this very well-known sequence, when there's just simply too much pressure on the B7 and D5 pawns. So after E3, however, bishop F5, and now if we take a similar scenario, queen B3, black can just play queen C7, and because we don't have a knight on C3, we just cannot simply win the pawn. So after knight c3 though, which is why I played in the game, usually black is going to play e6, and it's important to note in this position what white wants to do is you want to play knight h4, try and win the bishop here. For example, black can play bishop g6, and white has a bunch of options, but for simplicity's sake, let's say we take, and basically what we have is a position where white has the 2 bishops and is hoping that eventually things are going to open up, and then long term that advantage of the 2 bishops is going to tell. However, because black has, traded off the bad bishop with all their central pawns and light squares, they have a very solid pawn structure, and it's kind of very difficult to actually crack their position. But this is sort of what white is aiming for when we play this whole kind of variation. When we allow bishop f5, we have to be okay going for these positions where, a6 is actually played in the game, but we go for the bishop here. Black is very solid, so are we, and we're just going to have a very sort of small advantage. If you're not the type of player who likes to play sort of positional chess, this line might not work very well for you, but these are the sorts of positions I personally enjoy playing, so that's what I do. But Frederick, after some thinking, plays a6, and I think he was also a bit late to the game. I don't know whether he actually prepared this, but a6 is an interesting move because it's sort of like a hybrid between what we'd call a Chebanenko Slav with going to a6, and then sort of a more classical Slav move, bishop f5. You're combining the 2 moves, and very likely what you're going to do is play b5 at some point. However, despite this move not being as popular as e6 in this position, I faced it quite a bit in online blitz over the years, and so I have a fairly decent idea of what to do against it. And the line I ended up playing was this move knight e5. And basically the idea of knight e5 is that if black plays e6 now, they have to really watch out for their bishop sort of being trapped. And what I mean by that is, let's say g4, bishop g6, h4. And if they just do nothing, for example, well, bye-bye the bishop, because bishop e4 now, their only move, and f3, it's gone. So what they need to do probably is either move the h-pawn to h6 or h5. Either one of those cases, though, not very nice, because then we take, they get these ugly doubled g-pawns. This is also isolated, and we can very easily crack down on this pawn. It's not looking very nice for them. So what the main move is for black in this position is to actually play knight bd7, immediately counterattack the knight on e5. I think Frederick said after the game, we talked a little bit, that he was worried about g4, when I don't think he was a big fan of these positions. If d takes e5, that's nothing to be concerned about because you just win a pawn like that. But if g takes f5, I think you also just move the knight back. And to be honest, I don't think this is too scary. White's position seems a little bit weird because they played all these weakening moves. So what usually happens after knight bd7 is white really tries to make use of the fact that the queen is now being cut off from defending d5, go queen b3 immediately, and then there's some precise theory black needs to know after queen c7, takes, and all these moves. When if white now takes on d5, then there's e6, and the queen's being kicked away, this pawn's very likely to drop. So usually what happens is after c takes d5, white usually doesn't bother taking that. They usually either play bishop d2 or bishop e2, try and develop very quickly, and take the game from there. However, it was very strange because Frederick didn't do any of those moves. After knight e5, he took a bit of a think, and he ended up playing knight e4 after 10 minutes of thinking. And to be honest, when I saw the move, I knew it was bad, and I wasn't really sure what he was thinking of for those 10 minutes. And after some thinking, I eventually play queen b3, trying to see if there's anything that I maybe have not seen. But to be honest, I just couldn't really see it. To be honest, I was thinking maybe he was contemplating b5, which is actually a move I don't think I've ever seen in this position, but it would sort of make some sense, right? Because they just played a6, so they're trying to expand on the queen side. The engine doesn't like it so much, but it is somewhat of a logical idea. Whereas knight e4, I mean, you're moving the same piece twice, and it's like, okay, what are you trying to do, right? You're trying to take on c3, because I don't even really think that helps you. I just take back, and arguably that helps improve my pawn structure. So I ultimately just end up playing queen b3 though, which is a very logical move, just trying to attack the b7 and d5 pawns. It never really even registered in my mind that I would, for example, take this, by the way, because like, okay, then they just take back queen b3 and they can probably defend the b7 pawn somehow, something like rook a7, maybe even going b5. So what I ended up doing was just queen b3. I felt no need to kind of take there and help activate their bishop. And basically there are two sorts of things that black can do in this position. Either they can take my knight and hope that after queen takes b7, somehow they're not in deep shit. Also, by the way, I don't think I'd take back, because then they can either play rook a7 or b5, and they're probably not doing so badly in those sorts of positions. But if instead after this they go, for example, b5 or rook a7, let's just say b5, for example, this wasn't played in the game, but it was very similar. Now they have to be very cautious about what's going to happen after c takes d5, because if they take back, we take, and I meant to actually take the queen. Maybe taking the knight's also okay, but I am always slightly worried about something like bishop e6 and them winning material. So let's just say queen takes d5. Okay, we're up a pawn, and it's pretty hopeless for black. So maybe black can also go takes, actually, and then after takes, take back. And perhaps maybe you could argue they're not doing too badly here. I would still say after a4, putting pressure on these queenside pawns, it's going to collapse. But there's no need to even really look at this, because after b takes c3, well, rather instead of it, we can actually just go d takes c6, and the whole point is that we're still threatening to take this, and we're also threatening to give them mate in 1. If they go back to d5, well, I'll give you a moment to figure out what white would do here. It's quite a nice idea. Something very similar happened in the game. Basically, the point is we go c7, and after knight takes c7, they drop mate again. And if they take it, which is basically the only other logical option, then we just take in d5, and again, we're a pawn up. Nothing really too much to complain about. So that was the dilemma that our opponent here was facing, and Frederick ended up going for rook a7, which is very similar, because again, after knight takes e3, queen takes b7, this also wasn't looking too promising. I think the engine said black's best option actually was this, and to go knight d7, and then like, wow, this sort of position where like you're a pawn down, but somehow maybe you're not doing too badly, I don't know. But I was thinking during the game maybe he could try and like bring the knight back or something and like trap the queen in the corner, but I was pretty sure like very quickly that this just would never work, because like even queen c7, for example, I can just go knight takes c6, and you don't have time to go knight b6 and trap the queen, because well, then I'm just going to take the knight. If you take this, then this can't be very good. So what happened in the game? Rook a7, and as I said, right, I'm going to take, knight takes, take. That's a problem. That's also a problem. And yeah, he played knight e5, but then c7, and we get this position where I'm essentially up a pawn, and that doesn't necessarily guarantee the win. It's still possible. Maybe I could somehow screw it up, but I think everyone can agree here, this isn't exactly what black was dreaming of coming to the game. And to put things into context, right, like if you look at the times on the clock, it probably hadn't even, maybe it'd just been over an hour the round had been going, and he's already reached this like very depressing position with very little prospects. He's also down 20 minutes on the clock, so yeah, I won't go on too much about that. I think you guys get the point. But okay, we have queen c4 now, and it's very difficult for him to actually, because usually the advice is when you have this sort of position, you should avoid a queen trade. The problem is that black is so behind in development that if they like make another queen move, for example, they have to seriously worry about them just not dying on the spot due to something like, let's say, queen a4 check, when if they go b5, I take, and if they take back, they're going to drop the rook. If they go knight e7, I think we can go bishop b5 anyway. And like, how do they stop us from really just taking that and winning material? I don't know. And if they take, again, we win the rook. So I think it was a smart decision on Frederick's part to not get too ambitious and try to like follow some advice when it doesn't really apply to the position. Instead, he played b5, trying to trade of the queens, but at least like do it on his terms. And what I mean by that is like if he takes right and we take back, we sort of develop with tempo, but at least in this case, right, he can bring his rook into the game when the queen trade happens. But okay, still I'm a pawn up, and my pawn structure is also compact, perfect pretty much, so not really much I can complain about. I play bishop d3, develop another piece while also initiating the piece exchange. So takes happens, bishop d2, castles, and to be honest, I was thinking a little bit maybe he could go knight c6 to stop my bishop from invading, because when I saw castles, I was like, well, now already I can consider, for example, bishop b4, trade off my sort of bad bishop, and then after takes, I can play king d2, bring the rook to c1, and it's very difficult to imagine this really going wrong at all. But I decided to get a little bit fancy here and first play bishop f5, with the idea that, okay, like the rook's going to be forced to move now. Either it goes to like, well, if it goes to c2, first of all, we should take a note that we just kick it away with king d1 very calmly. And notice how our knight's doing a very nice job here, controlling all the rook's entry squares, which pretty much again forces the rook all the way back to where it came from. And then, let's say it goes to like c6, for example, we go to b4, trade, gain another tempo, and basically the whole point with bishop a5 is that whenever we take back on b4, either we're going to be hitting the rook with tempo, or they're going to be on a square like c8, which blocks the other rook from coming into the game. But okay, this is a very small detail. I don't think it matters that much. I probably could have just as easily played bishop b4 and been just fine. Pretty much everything, well, all roads lead to Rome, you could say. But okay, so what we had, he plays rook c4 provoking b3. I don't know how much that helps, but okay, so what we had. Now I play bishop b4. If he takes, take note that he can hide on b2 for a bit, but again, we're going to be going back to d3, king d1, and has to go back to where it came from. If you come to c8, I can just go rook c1, and you're pretty much forced to exchange, or either you go back and allow an exchange. And again, I'm going to go king d2, knight d3, rook c1, and if you exchange all the rooks off, it should be a fairly easy win in the knight endgame. Typically, it's said about knight endgames that they're like pawn endgames, which means that like in a pawn endgame, usually if you're a pawn up and they're not doubled or some weird exception like that, you're usually going to be winning. In knight endgames, it tends to be very similar. I don't know why. I was having a discussion about this with a friend the other day, but just trust me, that's sort of how it works. But okay, after bishop b4 happened, he moves his rook to d8, I kick the rook out, we have an exchange. The knight now can come to c6, I play king e2, f6, and this is where I have to be a little bit careful, because I was like, if I just play rook c1, for example, e5 could actually be a little bit nasty. And this is very important to note, because a lot of players, when they get this sort of like winning position, they tend to relax, they sort of, you know, take the foot off the pedal a little bit. But when you have a really winning position, what you want to do is really exert yourself 10 times harder, because that way not only you're going to be aware of all your opponent's small tricks, but you're also probably just going to win quicker because you're going to be applying more effort into really finishing them off. So I played rook h-d1. In fact, it's not really that bad to allow e5, I reckon, because if you go knight d5 here, well then after e takes d4, you have knight b7, you win the exchange, and they can give a check, but so what, right? So if they try to avoid that fork, I don't know, they move the rook somewhere, then we can take, and it's really fine, to be honest. But it's about the mentality, right? Like rook ac1, perfectly fine since e5 actually isn't that big of a threat, but you have to be watching out for that at the very least. I couldn't be bothered calculating, so I just played rook h-d1, rook ac1, bring the rooks into the game, knight e7, and maybe the knight's going to go to d5, can't really see what else it would really do, so okay, I just proceed with my plan with knight c5, just bringing the knight to an active square, and eventually what I want to do also is kind of double up on the c-file. That's actually what I really want to do, but in this position I realized I had to be careful, because again, if rook d2, I thought there would be this e5 break, and it turns out this is completely fine for white, but we have to play precisely. For example, what I rejected this move, or the basis upon which I rejected the move in this game was, if I move this rook d1, then I'm going to run into knight d5, a very nasty move. Of course, e4, I just, you know, like move to c5, I trade the rooks, this pawn's probably going to hang, this is also hanging. But if knight d5, guys, like, the problem is just that knight c3 is coming, I can't really stop that. And like, for example, king e1, here, my rook's attacked, boom, boom, and I'm just down a piece now. There's no way I can like come to e2, kick the rook away, and then win the knight. It's illegal. And after knight d5, I really do not see any other ways. So like if I go rook c2, for example, e4, I move the knight away, and then I run into the knight c3 check, and he again wins the exchange. So d2 is fine, but I have to make sure I followed up correctly, where in this position, if e5 does get played, I play like this rook to c2, or maybe even put this rook back on d1. Basically make sure that my rook is protected, and I'm also not going to be falling prey to some sort of knight d5, knight c3 check scheme, which is why I end up playing, before I end up moving any of my rooks around, being concerned about e5, I first play knight c5. Of course, if you go e5 here, it doesn't really make sense because like the rook's on d1, right? It's take and I easily exchange. Probably I actually take on a6 because you can't really take it because then the rook on d8 hangs. But okay, knight c5, and now there's of course the threat of knight b7, so he defends against that. Now I go rook d2, there's definitely no e5 problems here. Knight d5, and because I want to bring my other rook to the c file and infiltrate, I wasn't really sure if I want to go here immediately because, like, for example, he could sort of repeat and I don't really want to have to put a rook on b2 and then kick it away. So what I thought I was going to do was play knight e4, rook b6, now rook c2, and knight b4 in this position, I just give a check and there's no knight blocking me on c5 from doing so. So I thought this would be quite nice, and it definitely is. I'm completely winning according to engine standards, which makes sense because, again, I'm a pawn up. My structure is like pretty much impeccable. They have some weaknesses, and like their rooks are also kind of just staring at the b pawn. So basically, in spite of, as you might actually be able to see, I've spent quite a bit of time like playing all the most accurate moves. My opponent's been playing quite quickly on the clock, maybe trying to put some pressure on me there. Like, still, I'm doing very well, and black really has no clear plan inside. But he did play b4, and to be honest, slightly scared me because I was like, ooh, now they're going to play f5, kick my knight away. And the moment my knight moves, they're going to put a knight in c3, kind of make an outpost for the knight there. I move my king. They consolidate the b4 pawn maybe, which reinforces the knight there. And then once the b file is blocked, how do I break through? Maybe I can bring my knight to a4 and kick it out, but then like he's going to exchange. I'm going to get double pawns, and then after my pawn goes to a4, he can play b3, start swapping stuff off, and I'm like, I don't really think I want to allow all that. So what I do is I end up playing knight c5 before he could even think about playing f5, and after rook d6, knight a4. And my basic idea was that now my knight from a4, it can't easily be kicked away, and it's also controlling the c3 square very nicely, stopping any kind of annoying checks. By the way, you might be wondering, why not check here? But my idea was that with the knight on c5, at this very moment, can go to d7, fork these two rooks, and now I can take this take, and I have a rook endgame now where I'm just simply 2 pawns up. So that was my idea in the event of knight c3 check, which I was pretty sure he would not do, but instead went rook d6 to, again, avoid that threat. Now I went knight a4, but to be honest, this was really unnecessary, and what I mean by that is that this was actually never that scary, or like f5 and then going knight c3. For example, if I gave a check here, let's say he takes, I would not hang my rook like that, hopefully, king f7, king d3. I was analyzing this and like after the game, and as it turns out, basically this position is completely and utterly hopeless for black because like they get a knight into c3, and for a moment you sort of are scared because you're like, they're attacking my pawn. But if you actually go to the effort of like calculating, for example, and seeing that like, okay, maybe from afar it's like slightly more difficult, you have to like envision like your king being on d3 and stuff, but still like nothing rocket science by any means, you would notice that you can play moves such as a4, and you remove the pawn from being under attack. If they go en passant, they hang their knight, and this is never going to work, which pretty much begs the question then, like, well, what is this position? And the answer is it's not very good for black, because again, their rook is doing nothing, our rook is active, they have weaknesses on the e5, these pawns are also weak, our pawns are very difficult for them to attack. But instead, after b4, instead of really like questioning whether my opponent's entire concept was correct or not, I just sort of believed it and bought into his whole idea instead of trying to question it, which is oftentimes in chess the better thing to do because it involves calculating. Usually when you can calculate, you can see beyond what looks scary and realize that a lot of things that look scary are not that. So knight c5 though, knight a4, and I'm still winning, but okay, there's still tricks to watch out for. For example, like rook c6, rook c8, I was thinking for a bit, well, maybe I could exchange a pair of rooks because usually in these sorts of endgames, exchanging a pair of rooks just helps reduce counterplay. For example, we've seen in a bunch of positions how e5 takes, and like there can be some discovered knight checks, and these rooks together are very powerful. If we exchange one pair of rooks, it really diminishes the strength of, or a lot of the counterplay they have, and it's going to be pretty depressing for them. But luckily for them in this position, if, for example, we go rook c6 or rook c8, black was very careful with their last move to put the rook here to eliminate, for example, rook c8 coming with a check, such that now if we did this, they'd be able to insert this move knight c3 check, when this is a very nice interference check where the rooks are now cut off from each other, and if we take, they win this, and in fact we are in very, very deep trouble. So probably what we would need to do is play something like takes, and like hope that we're somehow still in this, being down the exchange because we have 2 pawns for it. But definitely coming from this position where like we're up a pawn and everything's going well for us, we don't really, of course, want to do that. So I realized that after thinking like for an idiot for a few minutes about like these 2 moves, that like, okay, yeah, I need to avoid that. So I went king f3, preparing either one of these moves, trying to initiate some sort of rook exchange. Since now, like let's say h6, for example, rook c8, there's no knight c3. Well, they can go knight c3, just doesn't really come with a check or make any sense anymore. So after king f3, what Frederick does is he realizes if he doesn't do anything, he's going to be in very big trouble. So he plays e5 to sort of stir the pot a little bit. And I don't really want to allow him to take here and then like move the knight somewhere and target this as a weakness. So I decide to take here and also give him a weakness on e5. I go rook c4. My idea being to prevent e4 check in a bunch of positions, target b4, and also more importantly, avoid falling again for something like rook c8, which might look like it works now, trading off a pair of rooks, but there's a very sneaky idea, which is that if he goes e4 check, again king e2, knight e3, interference check, and it's sort of like not over, but at least all the good things I had going for me very much disappeared, right? So instead you may ask, like, can we not go to like g3 or g4? But like, for example, if we just go to like this square, very likely what's going to happen is a perpetual check. And if we go to g4, it's also very nasty that, like, okay, if we just go backwards, it's a perpetual, but if we go forwards, you might think, what's wrong with this? But knight e7 check is very nasty. I saw this in the game. It's very strange, just like the whole position, but like, what can you do, right? There's a check, we're being forked, you can't go for this. So again, instead what I did in the game is I play rook c4, I avoid some of that stuff, and I think another one of my ideas was also to bring the knight to c5, trying to activate this into the game, because again, so on the edge of the board, it was serving that sort of temporary purpose of stopping any of these knight c3 sort of ideas, but maybe at some point that won't be so scary and I can then like bring this into the game, right? Maybe not now, but at some point in the future. So, okay, what we have is h5 though, and I thought this was slightly strange, although it's probably okay. It's just that now I thought I could go rook c8, because my idea was that if they go e4 check, which they did, okay, the same stuff with king e2, knight c3 still exists, but now when I go king g3, rook g6 check, I can put my king on h3, and notice how with the pawn on h5, there's no longer rook h6 check. So I thought this was a very opportune moment after h5 to sneak in the rook exchange, sort of make things a little bit easier. The engine actually wasn't a big fan of that. I wanted to go like rook 1 to c2, and I think one of the ideas was that it just wants to bring the king to e2 actually, and if we play like, for example, king e2 in any of these positions immediately, it can sometimes be a little bit of a hassle to deal with like knight c3 check, takes, and if we just take back, for example, rook d2, and like this, and there's like counterplay, we exchange the knights, and maybe we're still winning, but we probably have to be a bit more accurate at the very least. Whereas if you go rook 1 c2 for us now, like imagine just in random move g6 here, well now knight c3 just doesn't really hit the same, right? Because anytime this happens, we can simply go takes, and this rook helps cover the 7th rank, avoiding a bunch of pawn exchanges, which again makes the position more drawish for the defending side, as the attacking side in the endgame, the one who's up material, we want to avoid those sort of pawn exchanges. So rook c8 though is what I did, again with the aim of making the position a bit more simple. I'm still, I think, winning, but it is becoming, at least according to the computer, a little bit more difficult. So h3, again, I think h4 is actually stronger. The computer suggested it sort of makes sense because g5, h4 check actually in some positions I really underestimated. One of the points was, for example, h3, g5 happened in the game, rook c4, I attack this pawn, h4 check. I really missed, honestly, at first, that I just can't go to g4 because now after king g6, my king's just going to be getting mated very awkwardly there. I only, for example, might have looked at this when I'm like, okay, I can like pretty much bulldoze my head in with my king here and somehow make it out alive. Reality is not so kind, unfortunately, and after king g6, like, what am I going to do, right? I'm probably going to go and cry home. Go home and cry, yeah. So king h2, and during the game I was sort of expecting knight f6 to defend the e4 pawn. If you go rook e6 and defend passively like this, I bring the knight in finally, as I was talking about earlier, and that's not going to end very well. So I thought knight f6 at the very least. I don't know, the engine suggests g4, but to be honest, I was planning on playing rook c2, because if I took, I realized that this would be kind of annoying to deal with. If I move the f pawn, of course, is en passant, and if I move backwards, he's going to keep repeating, or I lose my f2 pawn. The f2 pawn I felt like is really important. I didn't want to lose that one. I wasn't going to compromise on that, so I wanted to play rook c2. I'm a pawn up and can sort of afford to do what I want to, I feel like. And basically the plan was I'm going to bring the king around to e2, play knight b2, c4, rook d2, and control the d file or trade pair of rooks. But it turns out concretely, while if I can achieve all of this, it's going to be a pretty bad position for black, and they're going to have very little counterplay. If they're very quick with playing like knight d7, knight e5, for example, and maybe like shoving the knight into d3, also contesting the control of the c4 square, it's not that simple for white, and we have to be a little bit careful in going about trying to convert this position. However, I was a bit lucky because none of this happened in the game. Instead, Frederick went berserk with knight c3, which I was a little bit confused by, to be honest. With I guess the idea that, you know, if I just take, there's like rook d2, and again, he's going to be aiming for some sort of exchange like this. And whilst it's probably still good for white, I just thought it was simplest to take here. And if knight takes a2, rook takes e4, I'm 2 pawns up, rook d2, f4. And like, okay, I'm threatening to take this. If he takes, I exchange and then win another third pawn. So I was like, what does he really do? He went king f6, but then I go knight t5, bring the knight close into the action, attack the pawn. Maybe I'm also going to go rook a4 and pick it up that way. I don't know if they go like a5, for example, but he plays knight c3, and then I just go, well, I could go rook e6 check and win the pawn, but if you guys want to see how I finished off the game, feel free to try and guess. But what I ended up doing was just rook c4, attacking the knight, and if the knight moves away, then there's knight e4 check, forking this and this. If he defends it, that's also no good, because this is just, of course, also winning. So in this position as a Hada, he resigned after rook c4. So like a very one-sided game in the sense that black really never had a chance from like the moment he played knight e4 in the opening. But that being said, there were a lot of tricks along the way, as you guys saw, that I had to be careful of to either just like not be worse. Like, for example, there were a bunch of these knight c3 cheapos we were talking about earlier. Like in this position where, sorry, not this one, but like in this one, right, where I told you guys I want to exchange a pair of rooks. I want to make it sort of lessen black's counterplay in the position. But concretely, I just had to be very aware at every single moment to not just hang something like this. It's very easy to get comfortable and miss something like this, and then be like, oh, I'm so unlucky, I'm so unfortunate. But the world does not give a shit about whether you're unlucky, it just cares about whether you saw the move. And luckily, I saw most of my opponent's counterplay in this game. The engine still didn't say I played perfectly, but all in all, it's like a very good spot to be in so far in this tournament after having a bit of a slow start, being on half out of 2, won 3 games in a row, 3.5 out of 5. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.